In 1942, Adolf Hitler was holding a weapon that he believed was more dangerous than the V-2 rocket. It wasn't a bomb, it was a piece of paper. To his generals, it looked like a standard British 5-pound note. But it wasn't. It was a counterfeit, designed not just to be spent, but to be weaponized. Hitler's plan was simple. He didn't want to defeat the Allies on the battlefield. He wanted to destroy their economy. His order was to print millions of these notes and drop them from airplanes over the streets of London. If he succeeded, the value of the British currency would collapse. Bread would cost £1,000. The government would fall. The war would end without a single German soldier setting foot in England. But there was a problem. The British pound was the most secure currency in the world. So the Nazis made a chilling decision. If their own scientists couldn't do it, they would find men who could. They scoured the files of every criminal prison and every concentration camp in Europe. They weren't looking for soldiers, they were looking for artists. They found Salomon Smolianoff, a Jewish painter starving in a death camp, waiting for his turn to die. An SS officer threw a pen at his feet and gave him a choice that was as simple as it was cruel. Forge the perfect British pound, and you will live like a king. Fail, and you die. Smolianoff looked at the pen. He looked at the officer, and he realized that his survival now depended on committing the greatest crime in history. Smolianoff was pulled from the mud and transported to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, just outside Berlin. But he wasn't taken to the barracks. He was taken to a secluded area surrounded by high fences and barbed wire. It was known only as Block 19. When he stepped inside, he couldn't believe his eyes. The windows were painted white so no one could see in, but inside, the air didn't smell of death. It smelled of tobacco and fresh coffee. The prisoners in Block 19 weren't wearing rags. They were wearing civilian clothes. They were sleeping in soft beds. They were listening to jazz music on the radio. It was a golden cage, a paradox in the middle of hell. The man in charge was Major Bernhard Kruger. He stood before the assembled prisoners, bankers, printers, and artists, and laid out the rules of their new life. He told them that as long as the printing presses were running, they were safe. They were no longer Jews in the eyes of the Reich. They were essential assets. But the luxury came with a terrifying condition. Berlin was watching. Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Hitler didn't care about the art. They cared about the timeline. They needed the money to fund a war that was starting to turn against them. The technical challenge was a nightmare. The British pound wasn't made of paper. It was made of pure linen rag. It had a specific crisp snap when you waved it. The German paper felt dead. It felt too new. Under ultraviolet light, the British notes were dull, but the German paper glowed bright blue due to the chemical bleach. For weeks, Smolianoff and his team struggled. Every batch was rejected. The paper was wrong. The ink was too dark. Reports were sent back to Berlin. Progress stalled. In the wolf's lair, Hitler's patience was running out. He didn't want excuses. He screamed at his generals that if the prisoners couldn't produce the weapon, they should be treated like everyone else in the camps. Major Kruger returned to Block 19 with a grim message. The holiday was over. He gave Smolianoff a final deadline. If the next batch wasn't perfect, the printing presses would be turned off and the gas chambers would be turned on. Smolianoff went back to work with trembling hands. He realized they had to think like criminals, not scientists. The problem was the raw material. They couldn't use fresh German paper. They needed dirty rags. They sourced low-quality linen from factories in Turkey, the same kind used for British currency, but it still looked too clean. So they engineered a machine to age it. They built a tumbling device that spun the paper around with dirt and stones, breaking the fibers, giving it the microscopic wear and tear of money that had been in circulation for years. Then came the watermark. The image of the Queen on the British note wasn't printed on top. It was pressed into the paper pulp itself. Smolianoff took a wire mesh and began to carve it by hand. He worked under a magnifying glass for days, his eyes burning, carving the profile of Britannia millimeter by millimeter. It had to be flawless. When the first finished note came off the press, the room went silent. It had the snap. It had the watermark. It looked real. But looking real wasn't enough. It had to pass the test. The Nazis needed to be absolutely sure before they flooded the world market. They selected a stack of the forged notes and gave them to a German spy. His mission was to travel to Switzerland, neutral ground, and try to deposit the money in a real bank. The spy walked into a prestigious Swiss bank in Zurich. He placed the stack of pounds on the counter. The teller picked them up. He felt the paper. He held them up to the light. Smolianoff's life hung in the balance of that single moment. If the teller shook his head, the operation was over. The teller paused. He took out a loupe and inspected the serial numbers. Then he looked up and smiled. He accepted the deposit. The telegram reached Berlin within hours. Accepted. Adolf Hitler was ecstatic. The operation, now codenamed Operation Bernhard, went into full production. Block 19 became a factory running 24 hours a day. They printed over 130 million pounds. In today's value, that is nearly $9 billion. But then the plan changed. Hitler realized that destroying the British economy was a waste. Why destroy the money when he could spend it? The order came down. Do not drop it, spend it. The Nazis began using Smolianoff's work to buy gold, diamonds, and weapons on the black market. They paid their spies with it. They funded the rescue of Mussolini with it. The prisoners of Block 19 had saved their own lives, but they had handed Hitler an infinite credit card. Smolianoff watched the stacks of cash leaving the camp and felt a sickening realization. He was no longer just a survivor, he was an accomplice. By 1944, the tide of the war had shifted. The Allies were closing in. Germany was burning. But Hitler wasn't done. He summoned his commanders and demanded a new weapon. The British pound was finished. Now he wanted the ultimate prize. He wanted the US dollar. Major Kruger walked into Block 19 and slammed a $100 bill on the table. He told Smolianoff that the Fuhrer demanded a perfect replica of the American currency. The goal was to destabilize the United States economy just as they had done to the British. Smolianoff looked at the dollar bill. He knew that the chemistry of the dollar was incredibly difficult to replicate, but he also knew something else. If he succeeded, if he gave Hitler the dollar, he would be helping the Nazis win the war. He faced a moral impossible. If he refused, he died. If he succeeded, the Allies might lose. So Smolianoff decided to do the only thing he could. He decided to sabotage the machine. He began a dangerous game of delay. He told Kruger that the gelatin in the paper was reacting badly to the humidity. He mixed the ink with the wrong chemicals on purpose, ruining entire batches. He blamed the temperature. He blamed the machinery. In Berlin, Hitler was furious. He was shaking with Parkinson's disease, screaming at his subordinates, demanding the dollars to pay for its collapsing defenses. Every delay from Block 19 was met with threats of execution. Smolianoff was walking a tightrope. He had to produce just enough progress to stay alive, but enough failures to stop the weapon from ever being used. For months, he looked the Nazis in the eye and lied. He bought time, day by day, waiting for the sound of American tanks. But time ran out. In early 1945, the Soviet army was crossing the Oder River. The Americans were crossing the Rhine. The Third Reich was crumbling. A panic order arrived from Berlin. Liquidate the operation, destroy the evidence, kill the prisoners. The printing presses were dismantled. The files were burned. Smolianoff and his team were forced onto trucks and driven south, deep into the Austrian Alps. They arrived at the shores of Lake Toplitz, a freezing deep-water lake hidden in the mountains. Under the cover of darkness, the SS officers forced the prisoners to unload huge wooden crates. Inside those crates were billions of dollars in fake currency. The wealth of an empire was thrown into the water, sinking down into the black abyss to hide the crime. Once the money was gone, the SS turned their guns on the prisoners. Smolianoff stood in the snow, exhausted. He had forged the money. He had tricked the banks. He had stalled the dictator, but he couldn't fake his way out of a bullet. The guards raised their rifles. But then a rumble shook the ground, not thunder, engines. American jeeps burst through the tree line. The SS guards, realizing they were cut off, threw down their weapons and fled into the forest. The prisoners stood there, shivering, surrounded by the greatest counterfeit horde in history. Salomon Smolianoff had survived. After the war, the Bank of England discovered the scale of the fraud. They were horrified. The counterfeits were so perfect, and there were so many of them in circulation, that they were forced to withdraw and redesign the entire British currency. A Jewish prisoner had effectively broken the Bank of England from inside a concentration camp. Smolianoff vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe. He lived out the rest of his days quietly, painting portraits. He was a criminal, he was a forger, but he was also the man who pulled off the greatest heist of the 20th century. He traded $9 billion of fake paper for the one thing Hitler tried to take away from him: his life.